March 1945, Osaka, Japan. Air raid sirens wailed across the city as Japanese anti-aircraft crews rushed to their stations. Colonel Masao Taniguchi of the Imperial Japanese Army peered skyward, straining to see through the haze. He had been told to expect perhaps a few dozen enemy planes, small groups, like the ones that had struck earlier in the war. But then, the horizon darkened. Formation after formation appeared, wings glittering in the sun, engines growling like thunder. The sky seemed to stretch with bombers, row upon row, an endless procession. Taniguchi counted until his hands shook, then stopped in disbelief. There were too many, hundreds. It looked less like an air raid and more like an airborne invasion. He whispered to an aide, "How can Americans send so many at once?" The weapon was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber of World War II. With a range of 3,500 miles, it could fly from bases in the Marianas all the way to Japan and back, carrying 20,000 pounds of bombs. Its pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, and powerful engines made it untouchable at high altitude. But the real shock for Japanese commanders was not the technology. It was the sheer number. When General Curtis LeMay took command of 28th Bomber Command in 1945, he massed more than 300 B-29s for single missions. Later raids reached 500 and even 800 bombers. No Japanese defense system could cope with that scale. The statistics are staggering. On the night of March 9–10, 1945, 325 B-29s bombed Tokyo in the infamous Operation Meeting House. They dropped 1,665 tons of napalm and incendiary bombs, creating a firestorm that killed over 100,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. It was the deadliest air raid in history, deadlier even than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. For Japanese commanders who had planned defenses against small waves, the shock was indescribable. Their fighter planes were too few, their flak guns too weak, and their pilots too inexperienced to stop a tidal wave of steel in the sky. One lesser-known fact: Japanese radar coverage was patchy and unreliable. When hundreds of American bombers approached at once, radar operators often assumed the signals were false. They could not believe so many planes could be real. By the time the truth dawned, the sky was already filled with contrails. Fighters scrambled too late, climbing desperately toward formations that stretched farther than the eye could see. The industrial arithmetic behind these raids was crushing. By 1945, American factories had built nearly 4,000 B-29s. Entire assembly lines were dedicated to nothing else. The U.S. produced so many bombers that some sat idle as reserves, waiting to replace losses that rarely came. Japan, by contrast, struggled to build even a few hundred long-range bombers during the entire war. The imbalance was humiliating. The psychological toll was immense. Japanese officers reported men abandoning flak guns after the first waves, convinced firing was useless. Civilians cowered in shelters, emerging to find their cities erased. "We thought the Americans had infinite planes," one survivor recalled. "No matter how many we saw, more followed." Another little-known detail: American commanders deliberately timed raids so bombers arrived in overlapping groups, ensuring the sky was never empty. For defenders on the ground, it felt like an endless storm. Columns of smoke rose so high they pierced the stratosphere, visible for hundreds of miles. Survivors described daylight turning to night, ash falling like snow, the ground trembling from thousands of bomb impacts. The raids did not stop with Tokyo. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of smaller cities followed. In Osaka alone, 8,000 tons of bombs fell in 3 months. Toyama, an industrial town, was 99% destroyed in one night by 173 B-29s. For Japanese commanders, the realization was crushing. Americans could send more bombers in a single raid against one city than Japan could launch across its entire empire. The shock extended to the Imperial Navy. At Kure Naval Base, home of the battleship Haruna and other prized warships, hundreds of B-29s struck in waves. Even heavily armored vessels could not withstand so many hits. Ships sank at their moorings, steel twisted and burning. Admirals who had once boasted of decisive naval battles now watched helplessly as entire fleets vanished under bomb carpets from the sky. Psychology cracked. Letters intercepted from Japanese soldiers at the front showed despair. "Our families burn," one wrote. "The sky belongs to Americans." Another said bluntly, "We can fight soldiers, but we cannot fight endless bombers." The cruelty of arithmetic was merciless. Each B-29 carried 20,000 pounds of bombs. Multiply by 500 aircraft, and one raid delivered 5,000 tons of explosives, more destructive power than Japan could manufacture in months. And America launched such raids weekly, sometimes daily. By July 1945, 66 Japanese cities lay in ruins. Over 330,000 civilians were dead, millions homeless. Commanders in Tokyo, once dreaming of holding out for a negotiated peace, realized their nation was collapsing one city at a time. Another overlooked fact: the Americans flew with near impunity. Japanese interceptors like the Ki-84 Hayate and Ki-61 Tony were fast, but fuel shortages kept most grounded. Anti-aircraft shells ran low. Pilots who did take off often faced 20-to-1 odds. One Japanese ace recalled attacking a formation of B-29s. "For every bomber I saw, 5 more were behind it. I felt like a single fish swimming into a wall of whales." By the summer of 1945, the shock had become despair. Japanese commanders no longer asked how to stop the raids. They asked how long Japan could survive them. The answer was clear: not long. When the atomic bombs fell in August, many Japanese leaders admitted privately that surrender had already been forced by firebombing. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were horrific. But the truth was that America's endless bomber raids had already broken the nation's will. For Colonel Taniguchi, standing on that rooftop in Osaka, the memory of that day never faded. He had seen not dozens, not hundreds, but what felt like an entire nation's factories flying overhead. "We thought war was bravery," he said years later, "but the Americans fought with numbers, with machines, with the sky itself. We could not believe how many came, and they never stopped.